So what I like to do, no matter who the audience is I like to start with this chart, because I think for some people, especially audiences that I talk to that are more on the public health side, or those who are really strong proponents of health reform and can't figure out why are we even debating this. Also, by the way, other countries. I've given talks on this in Europe and in Chile, and they kind of look at us like, what are you doing? But I like to start with this slide and say that actually it's this picture, which is going out towards 2050, and the red line around federal spending on major health programs that keeps some really well-meaning people up at night. And it's this picture that drives them to think about how to potentially reform what we spend on entitlements, because they feel this picture is negative for the country and unsustainable. And so I like to just kind of couch it as a beginning place that no matter what we all believe about the importance, whether healthcare is a right or that we need to keep the country out of deficit spending, this is a very real and important starting place, and it really drives, I think, a lot of the anxiety and the thinking that we're experiencing now as the administration has shifted. So just kind of want to put that out there. The other thing I want to put out there, though, is that fixing healthcare is not that easy. I've got two quotes. One, you probably heard them both, but the one the other day, which is nobody knew healthcare could be so complicated. I think how many in the room are from a healthcare background? So how many of you have been around long enough to go, that's just crazy? What were you thinking? If this were easy, we would have fixed it, back in the day, right? And so, I've been on this since '88, so I'm sure some of you maybe outstrip me on that, but I never for once thought this was easy. I do have to go through the breaking of the new grad student over the knee, like, why haven't you fixed it? I'm like, it's complicated. And just sit in my class and then you'll learn why. But that was funny. And then the more recent quote as of yesterday, that he thought being president would be easier. Again, I don't know why you found that. But it isn't. All joking aside, it's the reality that healthcare is really complicated, and as hopefully we'll talk in the next hour or so, it involves a lot of really complex trade-offs, some of which are going to go to the root of what you might believe or not believe about the role of government, the role of society, what people should be able to do on their own, and the sort of the spread of choices that people should or shouldn't have. President Obama knew it was tough. He was much more of a policy wonk, maybe too wonky for many, but he really rolled up his sleeves and got in it. But he also, I think, has remained largely open to ideas. He made this quote not too long ago when he was starting to kind of reemerge after some of those fabulous vacations, saying he's pretty much fine that they can call it whatever they want. He wants it to work, and he wants it to help people, and he wants it to sort of serve well what he tried to do. And so I think that he's still going to be around and still going to be involved, but he gets how hard it is to pass health reform for sure. So even before the election, and that's obviously sort of the jumping off point, but I just want to back us up a little bit. We know that there were a lot of issues in the healthcare sector for the country, and that the next president, no matter who it had turned out to be, we're going to have to deal with at least these three major things. And I'm going to frame this talk and talk about all of them as we move through it. But first and foremost, the future of the Affordable Care Act. It was already clear that things weren't working, or that we needed maybe more time, but there were some hiccups. We could see premiums rising in the exchanges, we could see health insurance companies pulling out, the financing not working out. In general, many people, even with subsidies, both premium and cost sharing, finding it unaffordable. So there were issues with it already that we could see, and that most of the focus had been on coverage expansion, and there were questions of, well, are we going to tackle this cost moderation as well? As part of that, then, we are and have been very concerned about the projected growth rates of healthcare spending in this country. I'm not going to take you through all the graphs, but you're probably familiar that we spend considerably more every year, and more than most other countries. I have a great chart that I'm not showing this morning, but when I was in grad school in '91, a health economist who is still on campus, when we were at about 3,000 per capita, said that's unsustainable. We're going to crash the country any day now in '91. And now, the trajectory shows that we're up over 9,000 and change, and we're projected to be close to 15,000 in the next few years. So we've managed to sustain it, for better or for worse. But it is a concern, especially as we think about the public crowd out that we see if we keep spending more and more money on healthcare.
Sorry, was that 15,000 per capita?
Per capita, yeah. We're getting there close to like 2024. That's the projection of what the United States, if we stay on our trajectory.
That's all citizens, not employed?
That's all citizens, yeah. That would be the U.S. per capita spend. We're at a little like over 9,000 now, which is about 2 to 3 times most other OECD countries, and we will get to we're projected to get to close to 15 if we don't moderate. It was like 14,900 and something. And so then the last one, which has also gotten a lot of press, is pharmaceutical prices, and I'm going to talk about that as well. This was actually one small area of commonality between Hillary Clinton and President Trump, at least in the campaign trail rhetoric, that they both felt that we needed some solution, some answer to that. So as we all know, we had a somewhat unexpected outcome, especially for those of us out in the West, where I have to admit I was deep in a bubble about the outcome. A very professional and personal awakening for me. Some of the key things about it, though, was that the Republican Party did not get the 60 votes they need. That's really critical for things like healthcare policy, because the way the votes happen is in some cases you need that 2/3 majority, which they did not get. They have the majority, but not a supermajority. And also that, as we know, contested or not, Hillary Clinton did get additional votes, more votes in the popular vote, which means there isn't an obvious mandate. What you come to, and especially from a business perspective, as well as a personal consumer perspective, is all of this dynamic since November has created a climate of high uncertainty. When we talk about what's going on, and you have anybody that you're having dialogues with, one of the challenges now is how do you make good decisions at this policy level, at the organizational business level, or at the individual level, given this uncertainty. And a couple examples are, I had the chief commercial officer from HealthNet, which is now part of Centene, in my healthcare finance class this week with some of her actuaries. And the class it was a pricing unit. How do you price health insurance? And they're like, well, it's tough. And this makes it really hard because they don't even know in 2018 what the individual markets are going to look like or what the blowback might be on the large group. And so they're really forced to make, once again, pretty big bets on business decisions that lock them in with less information than they would like, which, by the way, they've had that scenario the last couple of years, but it's even more uncertain now, and that really makes it difficult for them. They've committed, you might have seen they announced their results, their CEO is committed to the exchange. But other plans have to ask themselves, are you going to offer coverage and at what rates? Hospitals and health systems are also struggling with this. Do you expand your business? Are you going to have insured people? Are people going to lose insurance? Should you go into this service line or that? Really key decisions, should you build more beds? Also, should you continue the journey that many health systems and providers have been on about moving from fee-for-service and really volume-based reimbursement to more of this pay-for-outcome value-based? That's a big shift for them. And if you think that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid is going to move back on that, the question is, should you just keep clinging to fee-for-service because it's easy and you kind of like it? So that's a big set of decisions. The drug companies are also, as we'll talk about, thinking about their strategies around pricing and launch, given where things are going. They're definitely not escaping that. And then even in the investment community, there's questions about investing in the next biomedical or digital. We're still seeing pretty strong investment, but you have to look at the horizons, look at the climate, look at the ability for reimbursement or other things, and that's changing. And then people as individuals have to ask themselves this question again about, do I have to buy coverage? Should I buy coverage? What should I buy? It may be that in next year you could buy coverage again that doesn't have maternity or mental health or all kinds of things that now are all required. So lots of uncertainty, lots of decisions. Here's some of the themes. So while we don't know exactly what's going to happen, as we've been watching it unfold, there's some key themes that we know are guiding. And these are probably accurate not just in healthcare but more broadly. And we're seeing this as you watch other regulatory agencies, say in housing and environment and other sectors, think about this, which is this reduction in federal entitlement programs is a high priority. So the shrinking of the federal government. How do we have a smaller government? Going back to that chart I mentioned first. And that's driving a lot of activity, as is this idea that more should be pushed out of the federal government into the state. And just if you pause for that for a second, you can see that the 50 states plus territories are all very unique. You could see there's an attractive nature to having more customization, more flexibility. California is really different than Arkansas, which is really different than Vermont and Montana. But what comes with that flexibility and customization is accountability and funding. And so along with this idea that we would like to not necessarily mandate things at a federal level, they would also like to make the federal funding smaller and more predictable, which kind of ties onto this concept, which is similar to what we had seen right in retirement when we moved from defined benefit pensions to define contribution. So your employer now, although my employer, you see, still does have a pension program, but many do not. Now instead of saying when you retire you're entitled to a benefit, if they're saying, I'm going to give you a contribution every year, a matching or something, and I'm going to let you figure out what's best for you, and I'm just going to make a very fixed and known contribution, and you figure out whether and how that meets your needs. So that theme is also playing out now in healthcare as we see this discussion around moving Medicaid for low-income people from the current federal state match to a block grant or a per capita cap. That makes a very clear, defined block of money, probably insufficient over time, but definitely more predictable and smaller for the federal government. As well as you see talk about using premium vouchers for Medicare. So instead of a Medicare beneficiary being entitled to a set of benefits, you might see a voucher being given and then you can go buy on the market. So you're seeing some of these shifts being tested out. They've been roaming around for a long time, by the way, and they're neither inherently good or bad. It really trickles down to the implementation and how much funding is being backed behind them. And that's a key theme I would like to add, is that none of this that's being proposed is inherently wrong or evil, which sometimes I have a hard time convincing people of, depending on my audience. But my point is that they're all mechanics, they're all technical ways to get something done. It's in the implementation, and then of course it's in how much money you can put behind it to actually make it work. Another key theme is obviously here to let the markets and consumers have more say in facilitating things so that you get to a point of price competition and other things that feels more like what markets. The trick of that, of course, is that in healthcare, it's a radically often different market. Just because I have, as we do, 16 to 20 now drugs in multiple sclerosis category doesn't necessarily mean they compete head to head and all the prices come down. You're seeing a little bit of moderation, but it doesn't function the same way as you might think in sort of other retail or financial services. But these are some of the key themes. The other thing that we're seeing, and we're seeing this already, is that we know, right, that the White House and Congress are aligned, but we know that that's not enough, and we're already seeing that play out in healthcare with moderates in the far right and within the Republican Party themselves not in agreement. And then so you sort of have in the middle of, Obamacare, ACA still kind of holding on. And we'll see how long this plays out. This, by the way, there's the same picture of this in the Democrats, right? You have a similar split of those who say, really we're all in for single payer, and anything less than that is just not right. And then those at the far end that look more like moderate Republicans. So this is a reality, and we're seeing it play out as we don't get things happening. So the outlook for the ACA pretty much from the beginning has been unclear but fairly negative. President Trump all throughout his campaigning had said that was a top priority. Most of the senior Republicans in Congress have been looking for their opportunity to remove the Affordable Care Act. The reality is though, because of the voting scenario in the Senate, even if everybody in the Senate was of like mind, they don't have the votes for wholesale repeal. So the mechanism that we've been watching them work through is piecemeal change through what's called budget reconciliation. This is a technical way of doing things that allows you to make changes to existing law, assuming the change touches dollar inlay or outlays. And that's really the mechanism that's being used right now, and because it only requires a majority vote. Just to kind of step back on what was the Affordable Care Act trying to do, it was trying to expand access. And it had this sort of metaphor of everybody into the pool. And this is really where you see a lot of the challenge happening now, because what you really need to do is you have to find a mechanism or an incentive, right, to get everybody, healthy and sick, into the insurance pool to keep rates broadly affordable. If you subdivide the pool too much, put sick older people over here, young millennial healthies over here, you create rating disparities that you cannot fix easily. And so the point of the Affordable Care Act with the individual mandate was to try to get everybody into the pool and using other insurance reforms and things, but mainly so that you could spread risk and in some cases redistribute income. And so this went afoul of what a lot of people think the country should do. Shouldn't make people buy anything. If people don't want coverage, they shouldn't have to buy it, was a common mantra. And also it turned out, right, that the subsidies perhaps weren't high enough to help those with affordability issues, real or perceived, and the penalties weren't toothy enough to also get people in. And so in many ways the individual mandate failed. I do this in my finance class. I have students do decision tree analysis and whether they should buy their insurance for themselves on the exchange. And rationally, back when it was $95 or even at $300, the answer is probably no, unless you are very thoughtful about what happens if you break a bone ski boarding or run and have a bicycle collision, both of which are common millennial potential healthcare outcomes. And what are the costs of those? They also underestimate, not only do they underestimate the likelihood of such an eventuality, they have no idea, because none of us know really. Anybody know what a broken bone, a femur costs? So they underestimate that, so you don't think about that. But this is where we were trying to go, but it was very unpopular. And you can see from this chart, this is data from the Kaiser Family Foundation, starting literally from when President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act in 2010, all the way to late April, so just the other day. This is very current. And what you can see, so the blue line is people who report being favorable about the Affordable Care Act, the orange line is unfavorable, and the gray at the bottom is don't know, which I find kind of fascinating, because like, how could you not know? But apparently it's persistent. But what's also persistent is that we didn't change people's minds or intents about it, even those who might have been helped by it. And now we're seeing an uptick in favorability, largely because people are getting a little more educated, and they're realizing that in fact it might go away, and if it doesn't help them or a relative or a community member, they're starting to realize that the fabric of healthcare means that if you don't have coverage for 24 million people, they're going to seek care somewhere, probably in the emergency room like they used to, or not seek care, and you could have another public health crisis, which we were on the way to before. But it is very interesting that there's been an uptick, and also just kind of fascinating sociologically that it really did not budge, and I think this would have been a big surprise to the architects of the Affordable Care Act. Maybe it shouldn't have been, but I don't think they ever in a million years expected that level of disparity in terms of people's thinking. The reality, though, is that when you unpack the Affordable Care Act into some of its key components, you get a lot of people, even if they're not fans of it, would like to repeal it, which is the orange bar. They actually want to preserve a lot of it. And you can see very popular strength for things like the coverage for children up to age 26, eliminating out-of-pocket costs, basically for preventive services, protection for those with pre-existing conditions, things like that. Obviously, the mandate over there, less popular with both. But even expanding Medicaid was reasonably popular. But the trick is these things fit together like puzzle pieces. You can't pull some out like Jenga and not have potentially this fall apart, or have the key players like insurance companies and others be unwilling to function in the environment that's left once you rearrange this. So it certainly wasn't perfect, but it was designed to go together to complete some things. And cherry picking amongst these, which is a little bit of what's going on, is hard. The other thing that is sort of surprising and a little bit sad, and I think represents a failure of outreach and communication, perhaps something that some of the Haas marketing professors should have gotten in on earlier to help with, is that people don't seem to know that there is no difference between the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare. So we have an identity crisis, a real problem, which is a shame because a lot of people may have voted in ways that were directly antithetical to their best interests. There's some really great data, which I'm not showing, that The Economist did a study trying to find what indices besides sort of white male, uncollege educated, predict who voted for President Trump. Turns out a better indicator is this market basket of public health indices, alcoholism, diabetes, obesity, etc. And the higher that you scored on that in terms of the negative outcomes of that, the more likely you were to vote for President Trump. And so it just turns out that we didn't do a good job on a lot of levels. And just for fun, I was going to play this quick
As you know, Republicans in Congress have been hard at work looking to repeal and replace Obamacare right now. People have very strong opinions about the president's health care plan. And back in, I think in 2013, we conducted an experiment here on the show. We went on the street and we asked people which was better, Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, which, as anyone who knows anything about this subject at all knows, Obamacare is just a nickname for the Affordable Care Act. They're the same thing. So with all the attention being paid to the subject lately, we decided to ask this question again to see if Americans have learned anything over the last 3 years. And, well, let's see if we have.
We're talking to people about health care today.
Okay.
Do you support Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act?
Affordable Care Act.
And why is that?
Well, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Obama, so I don't support him in the Obama things that he's got going on. I'm excited for President-elect Donald Trump, so.
Right. So you don't like anything Obama does, and you prefer the Affordable Care Act.
Absolutely.
Do you support Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act?
I support Obamacare.
So if you were a senator and you could vote today, you would vote to keep Obamacare instead of the Affordable Care Act?
Yes.
Do you support Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act?
I guess the Affordable Care Act?
And why do you prefer the Affordable Care Act over Obamacare?
I'm not really sure. My girlfriend supports Trump, so I go with whatever she goes.
What's the main difference between Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act?
One is you pay, and then the other one is Obama pays for you. Pretty big difference.
What makes Obamacare better than the Affordable Care Act?
It's more affordable for the less fortunate, I'd say.
So Obamacare is more affordable than the Affordable Care Act?
I'd say it is.
I believe that Obamacare, the premiums are too high, so people end up paying more. So I believe in the Affordable Care Act.
And so the Affordable Care Act is more affordable than Obamacare?
Right, correct.
Right.
Which is obvious based on the name.
It's in the name, right?
Right.
Why do you
I'll stop there, you get the point. So the reality is that we've really not done a good job. So first of all, healthcare, this reinforces, right, healthcare is complicated. But more importantly, we've done a horrible job, apparently, of the PR, the press. So someone should, get a new PR agency on this if we move forward. In fact, the HealthNet team that was in my class on Monday, the chief commercial officer, she actually told my students, she's like, if you could do one thing, don't call it Obamacare anymore. Just don't give it any more energy. Just call it the Affordable Care Act and try to stay with that. And I thought that was interesting advice. So even though, so we've been watching sort of some of the work that's been going on, which I'll dive into in a second here. But this is a recent poll that was conducted between April 17th and 23rd by the Kaiser Family Foundation. And almost 75% now say that the administration should actually just not try to help the Affordable Care Act fail, but to do what they can to keep it, make it work. Because people are really concerned now that they're now kind of getting, just repealing it, there's no feel-good moment that may come from that. It could actually just be kind of chaos. And it could hurt people, and I think that's starting to seep in. I don't think at a full comprehension level because of the complexity, but I do think at a much more like, this is a lot harder than we think. And it's not happening quickly or easily. There's a lot of arguing going on. It's like when your parents are arguing, you don't really know what they're arguing about, but you now know that that topic is difficult. And so a lot of people now, 3/4 are saying versus the 19% to do what you can to make it fail. Because there's been some rhetoric around just let it explode. Let it fail, which you could do. So Congress has to figure out, right, what to do. And you've heard a lot of the R words. First it was replace, repeal and replace. Then it's been repair. And then it was a little bit of this rename it. And then it's been more of a revolt. And it's getting used, as many times healthcare does, as a football bouncing around. And President Trump has not been super helpful at times, especially when he came out and said that he wanted to have coverage for all with much lower deductibles, what he called a beautiful health plan, but different than what we have now. The idea of lower deductibles and coverage for all is not actually what is in the program, and it's not possible. There's magical thinking that this stuff is going to work that way. So not that there doesn't need to be reform, it's just not going to look like that. And so the team that's been working on it has basically been building on programs, that, a lot of which stem from Paul Ryan and his work over many years. And Paul Ryan is extremely steeped in this area of health policy. He released last summer a white paper called A Better Way. And he's got a lot of strong ideas in there, and things that, again, as I said earlier, none of them are right or wrong. It's the question of implementation and again, would they be funded appropriately? So what we got to right in March was something called the American Health Care Act. It came out in March, and they tried to push it really fast without a lot of debate, even before the Congressional Budget Office traditional scoring. Anybody know what date they were trying to make and why? Anybody remember?
Before they took the recess. Yeah.
Well, as part of it, it was actually the Affordable Care Act's birthday. Was March 23rd. And so there was a lot of, no seriously, there's a lot of symbolic energy around signing the repeal or something, signing this by March 23rd because of that the symbolism of that date. They were not obviously successful. We'll talk about that for a second. So what was this law? What was it trying to do that's different than the Affordable Care Act? And the interesting thing is, going back to that split elephant graphic, for some people what was proposed was Obamacare Light or Obamacare 2.0. So a lot of Republicans felt like this does not go nearly far enough. We said repeal. This is rename. And on the other spectrum, there were people within the same party that were more, well, this is going to hurt a lot of people. I've actually seen the good in my district. The Medicaid expansion has done, and my districts are 30, 40, 50% Medicaid. I have rampant opioid abuse. I have a lot of mothers and children. Like, we pull that back. My constituencies are actually in trouble, so I'm not on board yet. And so what was the act about? So there's a lot of words up there, but in summary, it was trying to, first of all, repeal the fairly unpopular individual mandate, the everybody into the pool. It was trying to incentivize people to buy coverage with some refundable tax credits, which were structured differently than the ones under Obamacare, but not differently enough for a lot of people, I have to say. But they would have moved from income-based to age-based, with starting at around $2,000 and capping at $4,000. So a much tighter band, and really, so by the time you were up to age 64, you'd be looking at a $4,000 credit. Younger people would get a $2,000. They did finally have them phasing out at certain income levels, because at one point they weren't, and that meant even millionaires were getting access to the tax credits, and that was driving other folks nuts. But they also took out, so you take out the mandate, which takes out a lot of the subsidies, and then at the same time they were potentially repealing a lot of the taxes that were funding all of this. And so gutting that. All of that was legitimate, by the way, through budget reconciliation, because it all involved money flow. They were going to leave most of those insurance reforms in place, like the very popular covering adult children up to age 26. The real murkiness is in this next bullet, which is about what are you going to do with the puzzle pieces around essential benefits and the 10 now mandated categories of things that health plans have to cover, as well as this idea around community rating, that I can't rate someone who's 62 and different than I can a 22-year-old. The Affordable Care Act limited that ability. It actually said you could do a 3-to-1 spread for age, but and there was a little bit of kicker for smoking status, but everything else was wiped out. You had to just rate people community rating. In this law, well, this bill would bring it back. It would allow a 5-to-1 spread, which is what it used to be. It would also allow for some other rate setting to be tagged to other health status areas. So this is really causing a lot of anxiety amongst those who feel that this is really going to unmoor what we gain with not having pre-existing condition exclusions and having more, everybody has basically real coverage, not really thin coverage. So the argument on one end might be, I'm a guy, I don't want to pay for maternity coverage, or I'm a woman who's already had a hysterectomy, I don't want to pay for it either. I just want to pay for what I want to pay for. My analogy is that I don't like paying for the Croatian Golf Channel on Comcast. I don't watch golf, I don't watch Croatian golf, I don't want to pay for it, but that's the package. And by my paying for it, I'm supporting the few people that do, and I've made peace with that decision. I want Bravo and a few other things. This is a little bit like that. We have to actually probably put everything in the bucket, even if you don't need it, because somebody does. Like, you can't just have the oncology patients paying for cancer care. Like, that will bust the pool. So insurance just doesn't work that way. But there's a way in the current law to kind of skirt this by saying, we're going to leave essential benefits and community rating kind of in, but we're going to let states file waivers to opt out of that. And so in certain states, and you can figure out probably which ones might pick this, it wouldn't be California, you could undo the essential benefits, you could not cover maternity or a whole bunch of mental, a lot of things that are now in there, and you could unhook from that, and then you could also potentially do different rating schemes. Now the flip side of that is if you choose that route via waiver, you have to prove a bunch of things like premiums will go down, nobody's going to get left outside, but that's pretty fuzzy, and it's concerning to a lot of people that we don't really know. But they would have to do things like create high-risk pools and other reinsurance programs. High-risk pools have been tried in 30-plus states, and they've never worked, largely because they've become underfunded to the point that it creates long wait times, or they fill and you can't get in no matter how sick you are, or there's all kinds of other things that happen. So they've not been successful. Doesn't mean they couldn't be, but you need really significant funding, and the backdrop of all of this is reduced funding. The other thing that this law would do is roll back the Medicaid expansion. right? So part of what we did was we created exchanges where individuals could buy individual coverage with subsidies. But the bigger expansion was actually Medicaid, taking the categories away and changing it so that it's pretty much a simple federal poverty line calculation in most states. And if you qualify, you get Medicaid. And so that was really where a lot of the expansion was in Medicaid. And the federal government paid for those people who became newly eligible at a higher match rate, a 90% or higher match rate, so the states were incentivized to do that. Now we all know because of the Supreme Court decision that not every state expanded Medicaid, so not every state got neither the expansion or the money. But those that did, especially say California, we have about a quarter of the expansion lives in the whole country, by the way. It's a big deal. So this law would roll back the expansion funds, which is ACA, but it goes farther. It goes farther. It actually changes the underlying way that we have been funding Medicaid for decades. So not only does it roll back the expansion funds, it would change this federal match to a block or per capita cap, which means that they would look at what you'd spend, they would then figure a per capita cap, and they probably put people in different buckets, disabled, elderly, children, etc. And you would get a cap. Once you spend, once you hit the cap, no more money from the feds. So for most states, including California, that would be a reduction in funds, and states would have to figure out what to do about that. And the levers you can pull are cover fewer people, cut back on benefits, so cover less stuff. You can add cost sharing, which is wildly unpopular for Medicaid for obvious reasons. It's a low-income program. Or you can pay providers less. Providers hate that. Anybody know where California ranks in provider payment under Medicaid amongst all 50 states? Second to lowest. So we're not the worst, but we're right there. And we're one of the biggest states. So that's a real problem. So for California, just to put our kind of world on the table, paying hospitals and doctors less to take care of Medicaid, that freaks them out. Like every time I say that, they just cringe. We're also a very inclusive state. We actually just tried to bring undocumented folks in the state in under coverage through a waiver, which we pulled back. So we have an inclusive mentality, so cutting back on eligibility will be tough for us. And then we also like to cover life. We think people should have dental care. We want to cover opioid addiction. And so we will have a hard time, harder time than other states. We're unlikely to do the working able kind of rules. So there's all these new possibilities for adding work requirements. You got to prove you're working, other things. So this is a big money raiser, though. This is where a lot of the dollars are locked up in this. This is a chart that the Congressional Budget Office put out when they scored the bill. And this isn't the dollars as much as it is the reduction in those who are insured. And so overall, it was at 24 million people would probably lose coverage by 2026, 14 million of those by 2018. Just focusing on the Medicaid alone, that would be 14 million low-income Americans losing coverage, and that the federal Medicaid payments would be reduced over this period by 839 billion. That 839 billion is a lot of what's potentially wanted to fund tax cuts and other things that they want to do. And so that's why getting Medicare, getting health reform prior to the tax reform was kind of important on some level. Not only reason, but it was part of it. And so this picture concerns people, luckily, broadly. And this is actually the picture that a lot of Republican governors and senators and even folks in the House kind of took apart and realized that this would be really bad for their constituencies, and they would not be happy about it. Some of the other key realities about this offering, which were a little bit hard to wrap your brain around if you think about why you would do this, but as I mentioned earlier, the combination of moving to allow a 5-to-1 rate spread so that you could charge older people 5 times as much as younger people, and making the credits age-based and very fixed between $2,000 and $4,000 means things that the people who are in the 55 to 64, so pre-Medicare, would face both lower support and higher premiums. And the CBO said that a 64-year-old with an annual income of $26,500 would see their average premium go from $1,700 to $14,600. So, and that played out all over. So the younger millennial people kind of win on this one. The older Americans lost, and who votes? Just by the way, do millennials vote? Sometimes, but not as often as the people in that. So I thought that was politically not very smart, but that's how it's set up. There's also a lot of challenges, and these were actually called out quite often, especially the opioid addiction, by Republicans as well as Democrats, be very negative. And then we can see that Planned Parenthood funding has often been linked to this. And so for those who are supportive of the Women's Health Clinic and the work that they do, that's a real problem. Steve Lieberman, who's at the Brookings Institute, he used to be at CBO, he basically said, look, all of these changes shift more costs and risk to beneficiaries, to people, because they're going to incur higher out-of-pocket expenses and then also more risk and cost to the states. And they're going to have to figure out what to do. We already kind of talked about that. So this stuff is hard, and you can't move money out of one big bucket like the federal budget and not have it felt. And what would that look like in California, just to be clear? So this was work done actually by our own UC Berkeley Labor Center, Ken Jacobs and his folks. So they look at this a lot for jobs and the general economy, and they took a look. They've been following this hit. And they said that a partial ACA repeal would mean about $20 billion in lost federal health care spending to the state. You would gain some money in tax cuts and penalties, but it wouldn't obviously, would still leave a big deficit. We would also potentially see over 200,000 lost jobs. And to put some real numbers to it, our expansion Medi-Cal lives in California are 3.7, and we have 1.2 million people who got coverage via Covered California, our exchange, 85 to 90% of which who receive subsidies. So if the subsidies go, then that would be hard, even if the exchange functionally exists. So it has a big impact on our state. We went all in on this, and so it's a big deal.
What was it, 20 billion over how many years?
This is over out to 2026. I'm happy to send any of these studies back if people are interested in follow-up, but Ken Jacobs and the Labor Center, really great stuff. So this died, right? So they didn't take a vote. They got very close. They realized that they didn't have the votes. And rather than have a vote and have that uncomfortable moment, they pulled it in late March. They went away for recess, and it kind of looked dead. It kind of looked like they were going to move on to taxes and the border wall and just getting the government funded, because we have to do that, right? We have to fund the government. And so it looked like healthcare might just slip into the back. Then it surged back again. And all of a sudden there was a lot of conversation. The Freedom Caucus, which took a lot of beating on Trump's Twitter account for their role in not going along with this previous, so the very conservative part of the party, they stepped forward and started having conversations with representatives from the Tuesday Republicans, which are the more moderate Republicans. But the thinking was that today is the 100th day, right? So we're right at the moment. And that there was a desire to have accomplishments by the 100th day, so perhaps we should take another run at this healthcare thing and see if we can bang it out in a week. Again, probably not likely, but I think some folks really wanted to score some wins. This would not have been my pick, nor would the wall, but whatever. And so the polls had already been showing that Trump's his 100-day report card, which he alternatively says he cares about and couldn't care less about, actually the harshest grades were on healthcare. Very few people were giving him an A, less than 9%. And that includes only 16% of his own voters. Only about a third of the poll folks gave him an F. But we did see all this increased activity, and it felt like maybe it was something to do with the 100th day. Although you saw Paul Ryan being very moderated about it, and he was like, we're not going to rush a vote, we're not going to have a symbolic vote, and I think that was probably wise expectation setting. Although there was a lot of activity, and something came out of it called the MacArthur Amendment, which was Congressman MacArthur, who's one of the leaders of the more moderate Republicans, was meeting with the Freedom Caucus, the more conservatives, and they banged something out, but it still seemed pretty clear that while they appeased many of the more conservative Republicans with some of these opt-outs on the essential benefits and some of this other stuff, they didn't make any of the conservatives feel better. And so they once again, they did some straw counts, I guess, and they decided, no, we don't have it, we're not, and they chose again not to take a vote this week. They say maybe next week, but they have some other big priorities funding the government because they've done a continuing resolution for one more week. And then, you've got North Korea, the wall, tax reform, and a bunch of other stuff. So they had decided, not to push forward. And my guess is that's wise. A lot of the wonky experts are wondering why they're allowing the House to go first instead of the Senate. The Senate is procedurally more complicated. It actually carries a lot of weight. And there's a lot of thinking that if you were actually serious about doing this, you would start a bill in the Senate and work the other way. But that doesn't seem to be happening for a bunch of reasons that are probably over my policy pay grade. But in general, what this means is where I started, which is it still means we're in a lot of an uncertain environment. We've got a lot of issues and challenges of figuring out how do we do business, how do we face challenges, how do we plan for things when we don't know what's going to happen literally from week to week. I gave this talk a week ago, or a version of it, radically different slides, because it looked like it was coming back. I'm doing one next week too, we'll see what happens. The one thing though, and this will allow me to pivot a little bit and talk about pharmaceutical pricing in our remaining time before we do some Q&A, is that this idea that pharma pricing might actually be a better place for a quick win. It's certainly an easier tweet storm, and pharma in general, there's a lot of, I think, obviously really great things about it, but they tend to take lumps in the marketplace pretty regularly publicity-wise. So there's a thought that maybe between the jobs and the pricing that President Trump might go there next. And there's a lot of fuel for that. So these are some logos and some names of companies that you've probably been hearing about in the news for the past couple of years, because there have been a variety of pricing practices that have created a lot of tension, first with patients and consumers, but also with health plan payers, and then of course then politicians. I think if you saw Hillary Clinton, she tweeted during the campaign that she was on this after some of the Sovaldi-Arboni stuff comes out, and some of the stuff after that, and immediately the biotech stock index drops. And so, of course, it goes right back up, but it is sensitive to that. But there's a couple of different things that I wanted to unpack here about when we talk about drug pricing. We're actually talking about a couple different phenomenons, and you might need different answers for all of them. So one that gets a lot of notice are the launch prices on innovative new medicines. And I would like to underscore the word innovative, which is different than picking up an old agent, doing some new clinical trials, going back through the FDA for a new designation, particularly orphan, and then launching at some high price, which is the Marathon story with Emflaza. Emflaza is a corticosteroid, right? And it's been available for a long time in the UK for about $1,200. Marathon picked it up, read a couple of pretty thin clinical trials, went through the FDA through orphan drug designation, and came out with a price of $89,000. And people were like, you've got to be kidding me. And tried to justify it with an R&D budget story, which is a very common justification. That didn't go over so well. That, in fact, went over so poorly. Anybody know what happened? They pulled the drug, they sold it to another company, and Marathon is shutting down. Marathon Pharmaceuticals. They had to pull out of their own industry association at the strong invitation of the senior leadership of pharma. They were asked to leave because you can't have any more of this behavior. Because we started over here, right, with the Pharma Bro and the purchasing of Daraprim, which is for really compromised HIV/AIDS patients and others who need this cheapest chips drug, by the way, to survive. And he repriced it up 5,000% overnight when he bought it, because that's good business, and took a big hit in the media for that. He, of course, had other problems with his hedge fund days. But the juxtaposition of that, and Valiant, you've seen the stories with them as well, all of those models are crashing and failing, because even though, by the way, they went on for years, that's been going on for a long time. We just didn't notice it as much. That unfortunately casts a problem on the innovators who they launch something that's really innovative but kind of needs a high price tag, and then they get swept up in this. And so a good example of that are our friends down the road who we love, Gilead, who came out with, oh my God, they cured Hep C. Pretty close, right? They lowered the viral load of a stigmatizing disease to the point that you basically don't have it, with a safety profile and a low side effect that's amazing. And they expected a parade, probably rightly so, right? You cured Hep C. Did they get that? No, because they forgot something. They priced it regimen neutral to the existing drugs on the market. So again, around $89,000, which unfortunately worked out to $1,000 a pill, which was just bad marketing. And they tried to make the game that it was cheaper than a new liver, which it is. But the reality is that they priced it, which is very common, that you look at the price, you look at comps, just like in real estate, and you go, well, the current treatments are at this price, so we'll price, and we're better, so that's better, right? No, because where's the fallacy in that argument? Nobody was using those other treatments because they weren't very effective. They were pretty horrible side effect and safety profile. And so because they were regimen neutral, big deal, nobody wanted them because they were horrible and they didn't work. All of a sudden you get one that's amazing and works, everybody nobody wants it. Plus the fact that the population that needs it is locked up in the prison health system and Medicaid, the two systems least likely to be able to front that kind of money. So that didn't help. So then even the innovators have been hit. And then we've just kind of continued down the path of launch prices for innovators being a very touchy place to live. Some of these, like Spinraza and others, they came out really high. A lot of these are orphan drugs, so obviously Hep C is not. A lot of these are drugs for very, very small populations. BioMarin, our friends that way, they just launched a drug. Anybody see that price tag yesterday? $702,000 per treatment. That's the list. With discounts, it goes down to $486,000. So this is a pediatric brain cancer, brain disorder, Batten's disease, very rare, 20 infants a year. It's a groundbreaking drug, but at $486,000, that's a tricky thing. Now that's not going to break a lot of people's banks because it's going to be spread, but still, we have a real challenge in this of how to price and bring really high cost, amazing innovation in and separate it from some of this other stuff. And so we haven't quite figured that out, but we want to make sure that we don't demonize the price, but we have to really understand. And a lot of the work that I do in my research side is in this domain. So I care a lot about this. A couple other things. So I mentioned this repricing of older drugs. I've mentioned the innovative drugs. The other thing that's really getting a lot of attention is this increases on branded drugs. So I think a lot of people didn't realize that drug companies can actually, in this country, make price increases year after year. And if you look at a lot of the data that's been coming out, some drugs, especially those hitting their patent cliff and losing their exclusivity under patent, have been taking some pretty amazing price increases to the point of over 100% over a short amount of time. That had been, again, going on for a long time, but now we're in a climate of really close paying attention. And the one that blew up was EpiPen, partly because EpiPen is purchased by whom? Moms like me. I don't have a kid, thankfully, that needs an EpiPen, but if I did, I would have gone to my pharmacist and purchased my new fresh EpiPens for the year for my kids. So they have one at school, they have one at daycare, they have them at home, and I would have been flabbergasted to realize they've gone up to $600 since the last time I bought them. Moms get viral. We get on the and you know what happened, right? It blew up and it opened this whole new can of worms of what's going on there. And the CEO there tried to say, well, no one actually pays that. That's the health plan's problem. Again, cost shifting doesn't solve the problem. It just kind of tries to get it off of you. And the reality is that epinephrine is also cheap as chips. And there's a little bit of patent protection around the administrator, but not that much. And EpiPen's a fascinating story. It got a lot of breaks in different ways, but it's even got its own generic now. But again, it was another highlight of we weren't paying attention, and then things go up. So all of these practices, and this is really the one that you're seeing companies think about right now, and how to manage. But all of these, President Trump gets a lot of focus on this, but actually a lot of this other stuff. Hillary Clinton was very focused on this one. And so generally, just to kind of summarize, you have a huge new market risk at play for a pharmaceutical company. It's partly uncertainty and it's partly the new reality. That you've got a very hypersensitive climate in the United States. And this idea that you're going to jack up a price at a huge, multi-digit percentage right when someone needs it. The public is not favorable about that. It's getting written about all the time. The argument that you need to charge high prices to cover your R&D is a slippery slope and doesn't apply in all cases. And they've done some interesting analysis. Peter Bach, who's an oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering, did a great study where he looked at the top paying branded drugs and the premium that they were getting and how much of that premium looks like it tagged to an R&D budget, and then what was the excess. There was a lot of excess. And so the idea is that actually working? Now I think it's pretty tough to drive a particular price to a particular R&D protocol, but still that argument is weakening and people want more meat there. And also obviously the profit margins are high in this sector, and so they get a lot of attention. President Trump, it's really not clear if he's friend or foe. At first the pharma CEOs were pretty excited about him because of the tax breaks. The repatriation of cash opportunity and other things were really what they cared the most about at first. But now there's this whole era of the pricing. And again, every time he tweets, I was actually at BIO, which is the Biotech Industry Association meeting, and some of the stuff at JP Morgan. We literally went on TV tweeted, did this, and everyone was on their things watching their stocks drop. Again, they go back up, but it's a dangerous thing. And so he's talking about drug negotiation, bidding, and he hasn't been very specific yet. And there's a question of it. There's some talk that this will come back, and what will that look like? I still think it's pretty hard to imagine anything meaningful there. And I think the industry's really trying to get ahead of it. And so, how many people know what Ocrevus is? Ocrevus is a new MS drug that Genentech just launched, another amazing drug. It covers formats of MS that were not previously coverable by any drug, so it's breakthrough. It's also really great on sort of the more common. And I actually had dinner last night with a guy that priced the drug. I know him well, and he was in my class a couple weeks ago, and they made a choice, right, to price below the current comparator Rebef, who they did a head-to-head with, 25% below. And he said that took a lot of dynamic with their parent, Roche, and a lot of discussion as a company, but they really felt that it was important to not take everything that was on the table at that moment, and that the 25% discount was the right thing to do. And so you're seeing a bit more of that. Sanofi just released a drug, dermatitis drug, and they also kind of took the same stance of they left money on the table, they priced below the current standard of care. So there's a question of, will the industry continue to try to self-police, self-manage where it can? Other companies have come out and talked about not doing double-digit increases, so they pledged to keep branded price increases below 10%. Other companies like J&J, they're more about transparency. If we have to take a price increase, we're going to show you how and why. So you're seeing some of this. Whether it adds up to real meaningful change in the trajectory, especially of specialty drug costs, it's not clear. And how much will the government get involved? What Donald Trump wanted to do was make a deal, right? He loves a deal. And so the deal that he wanted to make was, I will lower the bar at the FDA, and I'll let you get your products out faster, and you give me some price concession. Any takers? What do you think the industry said? No, thank you. Industry does not want the bar lowered, believe it or not. I mean, most people get that if you know the industry, but a lot of people don't appreciate that. They actually appreciate that the FDA is the gold standard. They want the rigor. They don't want to put, they would like better dialogue and more clarity and faster approvals, don't get me wrong, but a lowering of the bar would have been horrendous. And in fact, one of the two top finalists for the job, he didn't get it, Scott Gottlieb is the commissioner, I guess presumptive. Has he been confirmed yet? Not yet. But this other guy, O'Neill, efficacy is a nice to have, which freaked people out. His idea was, we want it to be safe, but efficacious? I don't know. Is that so important? Let it out there, let the market figure it out. And like the pharma people were like, oh my God, that's going to be awful. Because we are, in fact, the world's gold standard. Some countries just take FDA approval in their own country. And we also don't want the liability blowback, right? There's a whole bunch of good reasons why the science matters. And so this deal, which he was quite confident about, has just kind of died. Because this trading of price concessions for faster access, and he's already actually, oddly enough, with the pulling back of regulations and not being allowed to hire people, you're doing the opposite. Because right now the FDA has many, many tens, if not hundreds still, of open positions. And that's going to be the problem. And there's some concern of brain drain, because the FDA is mainly scientists and public health people at the end of the day. And if they don't want to work in this environment, they're going to go other places. And then you have a serious problem. I think Scott Gottlieb is a good guy. I think got some industry entanglements, but I think in general, I'm hoping there's not going to be a brain drain. But there are plenty of open seats at the FDA that need to be filled, and we're having a hard time filling them because of the prohibitions on hiring and some of the regulatory issues. The other thing going on here is the 21st Century Cures Act, which we passed, which the FDA is tasked with implementing. But if there's nobody in there to implement it, that's a problem. And so while President Trump wants things to move faster, some of what he's putting in place and sort of other policies that are not specific to healthcare, let's be clear. Some of the immigration bans are very negative for biopharma in terms of the workforce needs that they have, and so there's a lot going on there. But anyway, I'm not sure where he'll go next with this, but we'll see. So just a couple summary thoughts, and I'm happy to take some questions. So what we can see, and what we already probably knew, is that entitlements are very hard to change. Once you give people something, once you say yes, it's super hard to say no. And that's kind of, I think, where we're at. And this was the fear of the Affordable Care Act all along, that once you give people coverage, taking it away is really hard, even if you fundamentally don't believe in the giving of it in the first place. And you're seeing that play out in the kind of the machinations that are going on even within the controlling party, because a lot of people are realizing some of those 24 million are in their constituencies, and what are you going to do about that? And some of the hospitals that care for these people need the money for caring for them, and if you make them uninsured again, that's a problem. Affordability has meaning at every level, so trying to make the healthcare puzzle more affordable at the federal level without making real change, you're just pushing those costs down, potentially to less able entities to handle the risk and the balance of that, whether that's the state or the consumer. Healthcare is complicated, we talked about that, lots of difficult trade-offs, bluster, empty promises isn't going to get you anywhere. I'm feeling a little bit better that message is getting out and we're not seeing rush to judgment on anything. I think the next kind of key for the ACA is to see who files rates for the next cycle, because those are due any minute. Most of the health plans I know, I'm talking to, like the ones here in California, they're allowed, they filed, but if something goes super haywire, they're going to be allowed to refile. So I think that's causing some lowering of the anxiety. I think Medicaid's a target. I think all the rhetoric around Medicare is not going to happen. Medicare is too ingrained, it's too politically hot button. So I don't expect them to go after Medicare with vouchers as much as they'd like. I think Medicaid is for sure. I also think it's because the woman, Seema Verna, who's the new head of CMS, that is her 20-year plus area of expertise is Medicaid policy. She very much believes in these working rules and other requirements and copays, and my guess is that Medicaid is going to stay a target, not only for changing in the funding, but changing in how the programs work around allowing cost-sharing premiums, lockouts, things like that. And I do think we're going to see some more attention on pharmaceutical prices, but what exactly that looks like, I'm not clear yet. So with that, it's 12:17. I'm happy to take a few questions if people would like. Yes, Jim.
Hey, just out of curiosity,
sure.
You know offhand what other first world countries besides us don't have single payer health plans?
So single payer is kind of a loaded word, but I would say that most countries have universal coverage for their citizens.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah, we are kind of a standout on that we don't have a baseline coverage for everybody at some level. And the differences about that can be that some countries would have very high cost sharing, and so while there's a fabric of coverage, there's still a lot of cost sharing. But most countries have some fabric of broad coverage at the public level. You may have to wait, you may have to pay, you may have to do other things, but we are fairly unique, and a lot of it, there's a great book called The Social Transformation of Medicine by Paul Starr. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning book. If you want to understand, if you're a history buff and you like that, you want to understand the history of why we have the healthcare system we have, Paul Starr, S-T-A-R-R, The Social Transformation of Medicine. It talks about how we train physicians, how did Blue Shield, Blue Cross come up, why do we have employer-based insurance as the dominant form versus social-based or any other government-based. It's a great book. We had to read it when I was here as a student in public health. I don't think we require it. Joel Stewart, we could read it. So anyway, it's a good book. But we grew up differently in the country for a lot of reasons about our individuality, our resistance to taxation, other factors, and the book does a nice job of laying that out. And the trick is, again, once you get a system in place, it's not that easy. It's like a house remodel. It's not that easy to fix that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for that. I'm relatively naive on this topic, so learned a lot there.
Good.
You talked about the pool and Obama getting everybody in the pool and sort of
trying to
and how sort of that spreads the costs and stuff like that. But then on the actual sort of shifts things around. But in the actual cost through the supply chain, there was a focus on pharma and pricing and stuff like that. What about the rest of healthcare? Because I see a lot of actual hospital, the area that I am.
So there's all manner of inputs, right? And so just right now there's a lot of focus on a key input, which is the tech innovation input of pharma. You could also put med tech and device in there. They're very expensive inputs. You have to figure out how every innovation is usually cost increasing in healthcare, not cost decreasing. So that's hard. But absolutely, I mean, that's why hospitals are often the major targets for any kind of cost reduction scheme, because they carry a big portion of the cost, and they're labor intensive, right? So right as we're talking about paying people better, ensuring jobs, you want to squeeze on what's a major employer in almost every city, every town. that's going to be tricky. And so for us, it's a very complicated web because usually, a vast majority of any hospital's income statement is related to the labor expense. So they're subject to the input cost whims of the labor market. Many are unionized, so it's not that easy to ratchet down. It's nearly impossible to close a hospital because it's a community-based entity. Lots of health systems try. It's very hard to do for a lot of political, cultural, social reasons, even though probably pulling out hospitals and moving to population care. What we've tried to do, and what the Affordable Care Act promoted, was this idea of get off paying hospitals and other providers for volume, incentivizing do more, and pay them for value. And then the trick is, well, what's value? And Michael Porter talks about that, as do others. So you could pay for don't harm people, follow your processes, pay for outcome, or link it to patient satisfaction. In fact, we're doing all of those, but it's a slow shift and it only represents a percentage of payment, so it's not yet. The hope was, and where CMS was going, was driving hard on that. The new CMS leadership is going to take their foot off that pedal, and so it's unclear how far we'll go, but those are the cost moderation areas.
A lot of people say the use of data, personal data, and can identify areas of efficiency like you're talking about. Like, what do you see as far as the ownership of data goes and being able to use it more freely? Like, do you see data becoming property of the patient, of the health system, of the technology companies?
I think data should be the property of the patient, but the patient had the ability to allow it to be used in a de-identified way for all kinds of purposes, and I hope that we evolve there. We're getting there, but we need to get there faster, and so the idea that your data could be used in all manner from, like Kaiser has a great longitudinal study they've been doing that people can opt in or opt. Most people, I think most Kaiser members opt in and allow it to be used. Lots of people are being willing to give their DNA samples, so it's becoming more the norm. You actually just never asked people before, and you made it sound like, I want to see your diagnosis records, and then your employer might. I mean, we didn't frame it right. We also have cybersecurity problems in healthcare are real, so we haven't shown that non-de-identified data is safe. I mean, hospitals are getting hacked, by the way, and they're paying ransom in Bitcoin. It is archaic what's out there. I mean, HIPAA compliant has nothing on hackers. And so there's a real, that's a whole nother interesting talk, by the way, is the cybersecurity exposure. I think big data is growing. I think we're seeing pockets of information. Some companies are seeing that as an opportunity to monetize data. Like a startup like Patients Like Me, which is really just kind of a nice patient community. So like you and I both have MS, we want to talk about the drugs we're on, or our experience of mobility, we could connect and do that. Well, that's a naturally occurring pool of great patient-reported outcome data. Pharma companies have figured that out. That data is now monetizable, and it's a whole new market. 23andMe did that for a while as well while they were being thwarted from selling their tests. They sit on data. So there's different ways that we're seeing that. We have some problems, though, and that data's locked up in different places. We're getting the technological sophistication to connect it, but we don't have interoperability of EHRs. I mean, we have a lot. We did not set the game up to be successful, so now it takes some pretty hard tech fits, which is why here at Haas, by the way, you get a lot of students who are coming in those intersections of tech and healthcare. Like a couple of my current MBA pages are from Athena Health or Epic or other data startups, because we know that we have to, this is just like, we can't go on with this siloed, my data is not your data. We can't do that. Some of that's policy, but a lot of that is just tech. And so I think what's exciting here at Haas, and what I hope we continue to see, and you should as alums be proud to see, that we will crack some of that with our and others, and we will move forward. But there's a lot of opportunity there. You're seeing like what Verily and others are trying to do. I'm excited about things like digital biomarkers, this idea, the study the Harvard people did, that by my Instagram filter, not that I'm on Instagram, I'm way too old, but I mean, if I were by my Instagram filter, you could actually predict clinical depression or not. I mean, it's going to be fascinating if we're comfortable, right, to let people in. So there's a lot. You had a question in the back of the flag.
Mike, thank you. So earlier you showed that you showed a slide where the expenditure, the curve is not sustainable.
Yeah.
And in my mind, that's an existential threat to human race, since we're a big nuclear country, and when we go broke, what's going to happen? So
Paul, Ryan, and others would viscerally agree with you. Yeah.
Yes, it's a very scary.
Yeah. I like to show that because I think you have to understand that people are coming from a place of anxiety. They're not just doing this to be difficult. They truly believe we are at risk and that we are a world power, and that if we crash because we let healthcare, Social Security, or other things I mean, it's a real world view that a lot of people have.
So in your view, what are the things in play will contain this curve?
Contain the curve for the United States. I think it's going back to some of the stuff we've been talking about, which is the reimbursement. We've got to find ways to change how we pay for care. And then I am very excited about the innovation in technologies and how we're finding new ways to do things more efficiently by having, there's a company Ancora, right? So machine learning and algorithms and like data that can say I'm a woman who has breast cancer. I now need radiation oncology. I go see a great radiation oncologist. But that's just one guy or gal. Wouldn't it be great if they could put my parameters, my phenotype, my tumor type, everything about me into a system and then using machine learning sort hundreds of thousands of other radiation treatments and then come up with some of the best parameters and protocols for me, augmenting, not replacing, augmenting what the clinician knows. Like, I'm excited, and that means that you're going to get a treatment that's much more personalized, when you brought up personalized medicine, but it's also more cost effective, right? If we get the right thing at the right time, we bend. I don't think we should keep paying on volume. I do not want to see us going back to that. I think that we've got to get to pay for outcomes. I don't think that, but I'm also worried that while we need to manage entitlements better, I don't think that removing coverage from millions of people is the answer. I think you throw a system into chaos with that, so, yes.
How would you contrast the ACA's approach with the exchanges and the mandate with what Clinton tried in the 90s? And do you see people kind of taking a second look at that approach?
I haven't seen anybody take a look at it now because we've just evolved so far from that. I mean, there's some similarities and difference with the whole concept of like managed competition. I think here what they tried to do was knit together things that are already there. There was already an individual market, it was just dysfunctional. We already had Medicaid, it just didn't cover enough. And so they were trying to move these things closer together and fit them together, lock and step. I think anything with the Clinton name in healthcare is going to be tough. But they rebrand the names of stuff all the time. I mean, you probably know in California, we're going to look at universal coverage in California again. Gavin Newsom's going to campaign on that. There's already a draft legislation. I mean, we don't know how we're going to pay for it. I'm not sure if us as residents, if those of you are all Californians, you would go for a 10% corporate payroll tax or an individual tax, but I think we'll keep looking at different ways. I think mechanisms that the Clintons had out there will definitely keep coming back. But I don't know, I'm not even sure yet that what we'll see dismantled here in any short term, because again, once you say yes and put things in, it's turning out right, not that easy to change it.
Cleveland Clinic, Toby Cosgrove has done these evidence-based algorithms for all of their cancer patients, right? So now they're like you said, machine learning. They're using demographic studies to figure out what sort of treatment protocols for their cancer patients.
Watson's in a lot of the cancer centers.
That's right. So they have about 300,000 maybe clinical trials in place, current cancer patients. At what point in time do you think in the U.S. healthcare, large healthcare systems will be willing to share data among the facilities?
It's a really good question, right? I mean, you're seeing some pressure on that coming from the people with money. So like Sean Parker and the Parker Institute, he's forcing that. He's giving cancer centers money towards their clinical trials and development. But the hook is you got to share, you got to talk. And so I think that when you get money coming in like that, and I think we'll see more of those plays, that promotes that. And so you get 6 or 7 of the best cancer centers working on immunocancer therapies, sharing data, sharing protocols. You're seeing, what's the platform that everyone's investing in? Science 37. You're seeing some of these, I think a couple of the big drug companies just made an investment. You're seeing tech platforms not only enable it functionally, but enable it more broadly so that scientists can collaborate and that you don't have a bunch of labs across the country, potentially right across the world, chasing the same bogey, and they could, you could stand down or move forward more quickly if you were in collaboration. So I think that we're moving that way. We had protocol agreements in universities, IP issues, tech issues, and then money issues, but I think the money's going to trump it, because if you see the money from the NIH going down, people are going to be looking to the entrepreneurial and other communities, and they seem willing to step up. You see a lot of philanthropic money in healthcare, and so I think Sean Parker and other examples like that will help drive some of that. And then you need the bigger centers, I think, to step up and do it first, and then license it to the smaller centers who will never be that sophisticated in terms of that. And hopefully you'll see, frankly, more regionalization of some of that care. You don't need everybody with a cyber knife. So you had a question, and I think we might have to end, because I think it's 12:30, sorry. Yeah, you.
Yeah, so you mentioned early on that we pay basically 3 times as much now as
Pretty
other.
much. We spend 3 times as much per person.
Yeah, so what are some, in your opinion, what are some of the best lessons we could take from other countries and apply here?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the part of our problem is that we have multiple payers with multiple views, and so we have higher administrative costs, and we don't have a perfect lens, nor am I, say I'm not your insurer, I'm not that motivated to pay for your preventive care. I don't really care if you get pre-diabetic, because you're statistically likely to leave me when you change employers and go to another insurance company in 3 years or less. So the motivations and the incentives are wrong, and so the Medicare for all or single payer means, no, in fact, the payer is incentivized to keep you healthy and to do the right things. They're also a bigger block, so for if they are negotiating with their delivery system or their supplier chain, they're a block. And then you have countries like the UK, Japan, and others that culturally, they will do cost effectiveness at the federal level, and they will say no. They will say no to a drug if they don't think it brings value. We don't say no. And I don't know that we ever will, so I think it would be helpful sometimes to say no. We don't, by the way, say no at that level. We say no down here. Anybody know how hard it is to get a prescription filled for one of these new super steroids, a PCSK9? These are the ones that came out, Praluent and Repatha. They're statins that were supposed to be for people who don't tolerate regular statins, but they're way better statins. But they're $40 a day instead of 10 cents. And so the health plan companies are freaking out that everybody with cholesterol will want the fancy new statin because we like that. And that we'll move and that the budget will bust. And so what the health plans have done, because they can't say no if it's safe and efficacious and FDA approved. What they can do is put a 37-page prior authorization document in front of a doctor and push that across the table and say, sure, your patient can have that drug. Let me know when you're done filling this out and I'll give you my decision, and I'm probably going to deny it 4 times, and then if you're still in the game, I might give it to you. 80 to 90% of the prescriptions for PCSK9s are denied. So we deny like that. We inhibit access that way, not up here. But that's not efficient. That takes a lot of people's time and energy. So we have efficiency challenges in the system. We've been paying for volume for years. We've created underlying dynamics that are hard to roll back now. And so it's a diet. We've got to figure out how to really change behavior. And then we have a massive chronic disease burden, and so we're living longer. So the demographics are working against us. Although they're working against every country.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, this has been really fun. Thank you guys.